America has a dark secret, one so disturbing that those in power have spent decades trying to bury it. High-ranking officials, judges, and law enforcement, people sworn to protect, have instead conspired to hide the unthinkable. In this video, we're going to uncover 6 horrifying stories that expose one of the darkest chapters in our nation's history. Stories that are so disturbing, they've been kept from the public at all costs. But before we begin, let me warn you, what you're about to learn will forever change how you see the country that calls itself the land of the free. In 1946, something was shifting in Georgia. For the first time since Reconstruction, Black Americans were fighting for their right to vote. The Supreme Court had just ruled that white-only primary elections were unconstitutional, and Black citizens were preparing to cast their ballots in the upcoming July election. This terrified men like Eugene Talmadge, who was running for governor on a platform of white supremacy. He knew that if Black people could vote, his power would crumble. He needed to send a message, a violent one. The opportunity came in Walton County, when a young Black man named Roger Malcolm was arrested for allegedly stabbing a white farmer. A prominent white farmer named J. Loy Harrison paid Malcolm's bail, claiming he needed the man to work his farm. But this act of supposed kindness was actually a trap. On July 25, 1946, Harrison picked up Roger Malcolm from jail. Malcolm was with his wife Dorothy and another young couple, George and May Murray Dorsey. George Dorsey had just returned from serving 5 years in the Pacific with the U.S. military. At Moore's Ford Bridge, a mob of 15 to 20 white men were waiting. They'd been tipped off. They were armed, and they had permission from the soon-to-be governor himself to do whatever they wanted. The mob dragged the 2 couples from the car and took them to a nearby oak tree. Then, in a barrage that witnesses said lasted forever, the men fired 60 shots at point-blank range into the couples. In 1946 Georgia, white men could do that in broad daylight without consequences. FBI agents interviewed thousands. They issued hundreds of subpoenas, but they hit a wall of silence. White residents protected each other. Black residents who might have testified were terrorized into silence. One man literally ran into a field to escape FBI questioning, later admitting he'd been warned he'd be hurt too if he talked. For decades, 3,700 pages of FBI files remained sealed, hiding a shocking truth. Governor Talmadge hadn't just allowed the murders, he'd encouraged them. At a rally in Monroe just days before the mobbing, he'd been overheard promising immunity to anyone who could take care of business. He won his election. The perpetrators went free. Today, there's a memorial at Moore's Ford Bridge. This one is made of steel, weighs 500 pounds, and is built to be indestructible. Why? Because the previous 3 markers were shot up, torn down, and thrown in the river. Even now, some people are still trying to bury this history. But while the Moore's Ford killers remained anonymous, let's start with Birmingham, Alabama, 1963, a year when this country would show exactly what freedom meant for a 13-year-old Black child named Virgil Lamar Ware. In a single day, this city would witness 2 tragedies, one that shocked the nation, and another that America would choose to forget.
And they died in Birmingham, at the 16th Street Baptist Church, rallying point of the Negro Drive in the nation's most segregated big city.
September 15th, 1963 began with an explosion that shook Birmingham to its core. A bomb planted at the 16th Street Baptist Church claimed the lives of 4 young girls who were preparing for Sunday service. The attack made national headlines and became a defining moment of the civil rights movement. But while the country's attention was fixed on the church bombing, another story was about to unfold, one that would expose just how deeply hatred ran in the segregated South. Just hours after the bombing, while families were still searching through the church's rubble, 2 teenage boys named Larry Joe Sims and Michael Lee Farley were heading to a white supremacist rally in the suburb of Midfield. The timing was no coincidence. These rallies were common responses to civil rights progress, designed to intimidate the Black community. When local law enforcement canceled the rally because of the earlier tragedy, these boys didn't go home. Instead, they rode their motor scooter to the headquarters of a local political group, where they bought a Confederate battle flag and attached it to their vehicle. On the other side of Birmingham, miles away from the chaos downtown, life went on as usual for the Ware family. Virgil and his older brother James were doing their regular paper route together. Virgil perched on the handlebars of James's bicycle as they made their deliveries, completely unaware of the church bombing or the hatred brewing across town. That's when Sims and Farley, still angry about their canceled rally, spotted the brothers on their bicycle. Farley handed Sims a weapon they had just bought 3 days earlier, telling him to aim at the boys to scare them. But their intention wasn't just to frighten, it was to send a message. See, Virgil Ware wasn't just any 13-year-old. He was a grade A student who played football. He was everything America claimed to celebrate: young, hardworking, and ambitious. But in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, none of that mattered. Virgil was struck by the projectiles in the cheek and chest. He died instantly. When the case went to trial, an all-white jury reduced the charge so that the perpetrators would only spend 7 months in jail. But even this light sentence was too much for the judge, who suspended it entirely and changed it to just 2 years of probation. For the next 41 years, Virgil Ware rested in an unmarked grave on the side of the road. His story as hidden as his final resting place. No headstone marked where he lay, and no justice acknowledged his loss. His family had to move away, unable to even pursue justice for their son. The message was clear. In the land of the free, some lives weren't valued enough even for a proper burial. In 2013, 50 years after his death, Birmingham's Gallery of Distinguished Citizens finally recognized him. Far too late for a boy who never got to grow up. Today, 3 memorial crosses stand at the site of his death. But while Virgil's perpetrators walked free after just months, another would avoid justice for nearly 40 years. Before we continue, if you like the content you see on this channel and want to see more, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe. It helps spread our message and bring awareness to the injustices that have been swept under the rug. Bobby Frank Cherry thought he was untouchable, and for 39 years, he was right. In 2002, as he sat in that Alabama courtroom, he couldn't hide his contempt. While prosecutors presented evidence of one of the most horrifying acts in American history, Bobby smiled. He joked with his lawyers and acted like a man who knew the system would protect him, just as it had for nearly 4 decades. But this time was different. Let's go back to 1963. Bobby wasn't just any Klan member. He was a former U.S. Marine with expertise in explosives, the kind of man who knew exactly what he was doing when he helped plant dynamite under the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The explosion that took away 4 young girls, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, and Denise McNair. Their only crime being black in a nation that hadn't yet decided if their lives mattered. But Bobby, he fled to Texas and started a carpet cleaning business, lived freely for decades while the families of those girls could only visit graves. The most chilling part was that he bragged about it. Former acquaintances would later testify that Bobby boasted about his role in the act.
"You know, I bombed that church,"
he told one house painter in Dallas. His own ex-wife testified that he had proudly declared, "I lit the fuse." He was confident for a very long time. But in 2002, justice finally caught up. When the verdict came down, guilty on 4 counts of murder, Bobby's smile finally faded. Yet even then, even facing life in prison, he showed no remorse. Instead, he claimed he was a political prisoner being persecuted unfairly. He rotted away into the afterlife in prison in 2004. But while Bobby eventually faced justice, another perpetrator would escape it entirely. A man with a badge and a gun. I'm talking about Officer Leslie Dean Jones. On March 28, 1968, 16-year-old Larry Payne raised his hands in surrender, begging the officer not to shoot. But Leslie had already made his decision. This wasn't a random act. This was Memphis, Tennessee, 1968. 2 black sanitation workers had been killed due to a malfunctioning garbage truck. Black workers, forced to operate dangerous equipment, denied proper safety gear, paid poverty wages, and treated as disposable by their white supervisors. When 1,300 black sanitation workers walked off their jobs in protest, they weren't just striking for better wages, they were demanding to be seen as human beings. They marched through the streets carrying signs that read simply, "I am a man." It was a declaration that shook the foundations of Southern society, black men publicly asserting their humanity in a system built to deny it. That day, what started as a peaceful march had descended into chaos. And in the confusion, Officer Leslie cornered Larry Payne in the basement of the Fowler Homes housing development. Multiple witnesses saw what happened next. They saw Larry emerge with his hands up. They saw him plead for his life. What they didn't see was what Leslie would later claim, a butcher knife in Larry's hands. But in 1968 America, a white officer's word carried more weight than a dozen black witnesses. Despite witness after witness testifying that Larry was unarmed, despite the inconsistencies in Leslie's story, despite the evidence suggesting a cover-up, nothing was done. For 55 years, Larry's family waited for justice. They watched as the case was passed from one generation of investigators to the next. They watched as evidence disappeared and witnesses died. Then in 2023, the final insult, the Department of Justice quietly closed the case. No charges, no accountability, not even an acknowledgement of the witnesses who saw a boy lose his life with his hands raised in surrender. But while Larry Payne had one perpetrator, our next story would reveal an entire town's complicity in a crime that would expose the darkest corners of American justice. Our next story would put a face to American hatred, a face that would smile for cameras, lie in court, and decades later, finally admit the truth that got a 14-year-old boy dispatched. In 2008, Carolyn Bryant finally spoke the truth. "That part's not true," she said about the story that got Emmett Till dispatched. But by then, a 14-year-old boy had been gone for more than half a century, and his perpetrators had already profited from his passing. Let's go back to 1955. Emmett Till was a Chicago teenager visiting his relatives in Mississippi. He had a stutter, and his mother taught him to whistle softly before speaking to help with his words. She also gave him a warning before he left. Mississippi wasn't like Chicago. A black boy had to be careful around white people in the South. On August 24th, Till and his cousins went to Bryant's grocery to buy candy. Carolyn Bryant, the 21-year-old white store owner, would claim Till grabbed her hand, made advances, and whistled at her. The truth, as witnesses would later testify, was far simpler. Till may have whistled to manage his stutter while trying to speak. But in 1955 Mississippi, even this simple act could be a fatal mistake. A few nights later, around 2:30 in the morning, Carolyn's husband Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Millam came to Till's great-uncle's house. They demanded to see the boy from Chicago. When Till's great-uncle, Mose Wright, begged them to just whip the boy if they must, they responded with a threat.
"If you want to live past 65, you'll keep quiet."
What they did to Emmett Till over the next several hours was so brutal that it would shock the nation's conscience. Eventually, they threw him into the Tallahatchie River. 3 days later, Till was found. But this isn't where the story ends. This is where his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, made a decision that would change America. "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." She insisted on an open casket funeral. Tens of thousands lined up to view Till's destroyed body. Black publications like Jet magazine published the photos. The world could no longer look away from American discrimination. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice. Bryant and Millam were tried before an all-white jury in a segregated courthouse. Black reporters were forced to sit at a separate table. The local sheriff greeted black spectators with,
"Hello."
It took the jury 67 minutes to acquit Bryant and Millam. One juror later said, "If we hadn't stopped to drink pop, it wouldn't have taken that long." After their acquittal, Roy Bryant and Millam became local celebrities. Southern newspapers praised their handsome looks. They called Carolyn Bryant a Crossroads Marilyn Monroe. all to make a mockery of Emmett Till and to dehumanize the loss of life of a young black man. During the trial, white spectators treated it like entertainment, bringing their children and picnic baskets, while black observers watched in fear from the segregated back rows. Protected from being tried again by double jeopardy, Bryant and Milam sold their confession to Look magazine for $4,000. They admitted to everything. Later on, Rosa Parks would refuse to give up her bus seat in Montgomery. When asked why, she said, "I thought of Emmett Till, and I just couldn't go back." Milam passed from bone cancer in 1981. Bryant followed in 1994. And Carolyn Bryant? She lived to be 88, finally admitting in 2008 that she had lied about Till's actions. But no one ever served a single day in prison for Emmett Till's death. As we near the end of the video, perhaps the most chilling story is saved for last, when the state itself became the executioner. George Stinney Jr. was too small for the electric chair. At 14 years old, he stood just 5 feet 1 inch and weighed 95 pounds. When South Carolina dispatched him in 1944, they had to use a Bible as a booster seat. The story of George Stinney reveals how quickly the American justice system could destroy a black child's life when it wanted to. It took just 81 days from his arrest to his termination, barely enough time for his family to say goodbye. In March 1944, 2 young white girls, age 11 and 8, were found lifeless in South Carolina. The girls had been seen talking to George and his sister about flowers called maypops. This simple conversation would be twisted into something sinister. The police arrested George and questioned him alone. No parents, no lawyer, no witnesses. They claimed he confessed. But there was no written confession, no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Nothing except the word of white officers against a black child. His trial lasted 2.5 hours. His court-appointed lawyer presented no evidence, called no witnesses, made no defense. The all-white jury took just 10 minutes to find him guilty. Not a single word of the trial was transcribed. Under the threat of mobbing, George's parents weren't even allowed to visit him in jail. His father was fired from his job, and the family was forced to flee town, leaving their son alone to face death alone. On June 16, 1944, they led George Stinney to the electric chair. Witnesses reported that the mask slipped from his face as they applied the electricity, revealing tears streaming down his cheeks. For 70 years, this was where George Stinney's story ended. But in 2014, a South Carolina court finally reviewed his case. They found what many had known all along. George Stinney never received a fair trial. His conviction was vacated. Evidence suggested the real perpetrator may have come from a prominent white family, one whose members sat on the initial coroner's jury that recommended George to be prosecuted. But that truth came 7 decades too late for the youngest American terminated in the 20th century. If you want to learn more about the horrific injustices against black people, click here to check out our video on the horrific race riots that occurred in 1898 Wilmington. This was Black Stories Untold, and as always, thanks for watching.